Want to know what to expect and how you can benefit from therapy? Ever wish there was a user's guide? Well, there is, and lucky for us, the author is sitting right next to me. Join us next on Speak Your Mind. Welcome to Speak Your Mind. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps, licensed psychologist with the Human Development Center. The good news, we have very effective treatments for mental health problems. The bad news, well, you actually have to let us help you. And that's hard if you don't know what to expect. Well, tonight, our goal is to help you cast aside any fears you have about getting help by doing a little demystification about how therapy works and what to expect. As always, we want you to call in your questions. Explore this topic with us. So call the numbers on your screen right now. Locally, dial 218-788-2844 or call toll-free at 1-877-307-8762. And you can also email them using the address listed at the bottom of your screen. We'll be answering your questions throughout tonight's show. And joining me is our very special guest, Dr. Tamara Kaiser. She's the author of The User's Guide to Therapy, What to Expect and How You Can Benefit. She's also a professor emerita at the St. Catherine St. Thomas School of Social Work and has a private practice. Thank you so much for coming up tonight. We're not exactly in your backyard, and you made a special trip just to be here. I appreciate that.
It was lovely. The trees were gorgeous.
The trees are gorgeous right now.
Yeah.
And so, before we get started, I'm going to do a little plug for the book because I've read the book and you ought to really take a look at the book too. This is A User's Guide to Therapy. I understand that it's available. It's been cited at Barnes & Noble here, and I got mine on Amazon.com, but I'm sure if you have a favorite independent bookseller, they can get their hands on it too. It's a wonderful book, and I think after tonight, you're just going to want to go out and buy that if you haven't been in therapy already yourself. So, Tamara, I think the really nice place for us to start is just to explain the notion of what is psychotherapy.
Well, therapy, for one thing, is a relationship between a therapist and a client. And I think that's important because the relationship between therapist and client is really it's the medium through which everything happens. So that's the first thing to know. I think another thing about it is it's a unique kind of relationship. It's really one way. And what I mean by that is not that both of you aren't contributing, but if you come to me for therapy, all the attention is on you. And everything we're doing is about what you need, what you're trying to do, your growth, your efforts. And unlike most friendships or any other relationship you have, you don't really have to worry about me in the same kind of way that you do maybe your friend's having a bad day, or your mother will be upset if you tell her this or that. Or
I don't even have to ask you how your day is going.
Right. You don't. I mean, a lot of clients do, but that's right. It's really up to me, not that I don't obviously have reactions to things that you say, but hopefully, if I do share those reactions, it'll be with the idea of how can this be helpful to you, not with the idea of, I really wish you wouldn't do that because it's very annoying to me, like I might do with a friend or somebody else in my life.
Some clients have to kind of get used to that notion of it's a one-way street because that's so foreign to how we're socialized to being.
Yes.
We're socialized to having that mutual exchange of information, and now I'm in this context where you want me to tell me everything about me,
right,
including the things I don't want to tell anybody.
Right.
I don't know you at all, and you're not going to share anything with me.
Right. Not of that nature.
Right.
That's right. I mean, some therapists do some self-disclosure, but again, if they're doing their job well, they're doing it in the service of whatever you're working on.
Teaching stories, I refer to
something
them.
like that, right, exactly. So, yeah, I think that is hard for people who haven't had that situation. And sometimes it's just an amazing experience. It's such an opportunity. How often do we get to go in for an hour and have all the attention be on us and not have to be worrying about everybody else's reaction? So it is a huge opportunity, but it sometimes takes some getting used to. And the other thing that's interesting about it, because the other thing about the relationship that's interesting is that you can use what's happening between you and your client to help the client understand how he or she responds to other people in their life.
In fact, I always say to my own clients, one of the ways therapy works is that you will do in the room with me what you do with people outside in your life. That's how it can be that I can seem to know things about you without actually being present in your life outside of my office.
That's right. That's a really good way to say it. And I think that's right. And both our clients will do things with us that they do outside, and we might respond to them the way other people do. And we can use all of that to help them understand more about who they are in the world. And so even the thing about, I've never had anybody pay this kind of attention to me, can be a real therapeutic issue and say a lot about how what the client's experience has been outside.
And that real healing takes place just from that space where somebody will devote that time to you.
Exactly.
If maybe you have not had that in your life.
Right. Devote that time and really try to listen and respond without a personal agenda. And again, that's hard to do, but it's being able to really just be in that person's corner, in a sense, and not have your own needs be what's present there in the room. So
now, one of the things that you bring up in the book, in addition to the notion of the one-way street, is the do you have to be one to know one?
Yes.
Is how I refer to it.
Right.
I think you call it something slightly different.
It's similar.
But that notion of, if I am seeking help from you and I have struggled with, perhaps I was abused, do you need to have been abused to be able to understand what I'm about to tell you, and to understand and also to help me?
Yeah, and that is just an excellent question, and a lot of people ask that question, and my answer to that question is a great definitive maybe. And the reason why I say that is the real issue is you need to feel like I really get what it's like to be you. And I have all sorts of ways to get what it's like to be you. One of them might be that I've had the experience myself, or that I just know a whole lot of people who've had that experience, or that just by listening to you, I can really hear what your experience is. The downside of being one is that you might assume that because I've had your experience, I either have had the exact same experience, which I haven't. I've had my experience, which may or may not be like yours. You may think that if it looks like I'm doing better than you did, that may either inspire you or make you feel worse about yourself. So the issue isn't really whether I have to be one to work with one, is how I put it, which is kind of the same thing, but more, what does that mean to the client? If the client wants me to have been abused, or thinks I can't help her unless I was abused, then my question would be, well, help me understand what that means to you. If I were, what would that mean to you? If I'm not, what does that mean? And to use it to understand what that desire is about for the client.
I always ask them, what is the real question you're asking me?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
What is your fear? Is your fear that I won't understand you?
Yeah.
Is your fear that I'll judge you because I haven't had this experience? And maybe you've been judged, maybe you've told some other people in your life and you have been judged.
Yeah.
And now you're taking this risk with me and you know nothing about me, and what you would like is, you know, why should, the list of why should I trust you?
Exactly. Why should I trust you, and are you going to really get it? And are you going to be able to help me? You know, I think those are the questions people are really asking. But sometimes a client really won't even, depending on where they are in their lives. Like I can think of a client I knew who when she was first coming out as a lesbian, it was really important for her to have a therapist who was a lesbian. It just mattered in a way that 10 years later when she went to therapy, it didn't make any difference because that wasn't her big issue and it didn't matter to her in that way. So I also think that even though we know that in a way that's not the real question, sometimes for them it really is the real question. Sometimes another example that I give in the book is a client who was African American and said until she saw an African American therapist talk about therapy, she didn't even think that was an option for her. She didn't think African Americans went to therapy. It turned out that therapist really didn't understand her very well, but she said, I never would have gone if I hadn't. And so it does matter. It does matter in and of itself for some people at some times, and I think it's important to honor that.
And I think there was some research a number of years ago that says that states if something is really vitally important to a client about the characteristic of their therapist, if they're female, if they're male, if they're older, if they're younger, the vitality of that has to will wind up mattering in the therapeutic relationship, and that's what you just described, and that's what you just described with the African American woman, right? That she had to start there, and maybe from there, her next therapist could have been different, and race may not have mattered.
In the same way,
In the same way.
Right, yeah. Although interesting, because she did, her next therapist was Chinese American, and she said it was kind of still important for her to have somebody who wasn't white, who was more not so mainstream. And then her third therapist was white, and that client was also a lesbian, and she said, I had to really make sure that she got both being a lesbian and being African American before I could go there. So each step along the way, that issue of do you get me was important, and it just shifted a little bit in time. But
so that then brings me to my question of like the chemistry between the therapist and the client, and how important you see that as being in terms of the help that the client gets out of the therapy experience.
I think it's huge.
I think it's huge too. I haven't written a book. You wrote the book though, so.
But we both had the experience, right? Of a client comes in first session, and you know at the end of this session that it just didn't feel right, and that client often doesn't come back, right? And then you have the ones where you just click right away. I think it's key. If you don't feel like there's some kind of chemistry, it's hard to define what that is, but I think it has to be there or you can't do the work. Now that said, sometimes a client is very comfortable with somebody because that person is a whole lot like what they're used to that isn't healthy, and that can be problematic. Or sometimes the discomfort is about suddenly I'm in a relationship where the boundaries are clear and I'm not used to that, or something like that, which can end up, the discomfort can end up being a therapeutic issue, and overcomfort can be a therapeutic issue.
And you actually talk in the book about there are four factors that matter in terms of how much help that you get. One is the relationship between the therapist and the client. The client, though, is the one who's pulling down 40% of what matters. Tamara, spend some time with us talking about 40%. That's like balls in your court.
Right. Well, the ball is in the client's court. So the way the thing breaks down is 40% client, 30% relationship, 15% technique, and 15% hope. And what I find interesting about that is if you really take a look at technique and hope, they all wrap into the relationship anyway. Because if I like your technique, it's not so much, I don't believe, what does the study say about whether this technique works? It's, does your technique work with me? And your feeling about it and the way you present it to me and the way I resonate with it is going to be what matters. But I'm actually not answering your question exactly. The 40%, I think, really comes down to, is the client willing to do the work? Is the client motivated? Is the client getting support? Sometimes people come in and the people in their lives are so against them doing that it makes it really hard for them to really open up and do the work. Or
it makes it hard for them to they can do the work in the session, but they can't do it outside.
Exactly.
Because they're not getting that support for the change that is occurring out there. I'm trying to make these changes in my life, and I'm getting punished for those changes rather than rewarded and supported for those changes.
And I actually tell people that particularly if you're in a relationship where the rules of engagement that you've kind of agreed on, not overtly, but kind of covertly, when we get in relationships, we make agreements for how I'm going to be and how you're going to be. And you go to therapy, and one of the things that happens is you want to start changing those rules. And some people don't want to do that, right? I mean, you didn't sign up for that. So you're going to often get a kind of, I tell people, you can probably expect your whoever it is to up the ante to try to get you to change back. That often goes with the process.
We people are such lovers of the status quo
Yeah.
that if you have family members, people or people who you're living with, who didn't sign up for it, they're really gonna they like the status quo.
That's right.
Especially if the status quo is benefiting them.
Well, and especially if your change is a potential threat to the relationship, which can happen.
Here is a woman who called in and says, what are ways a client can be more open to help from a therapist, or be more open to just the general concept of help within therapy?
Well, that's a good question.
It is a good question, isn't it?
What are we?
How do I come into your office? I talk with some of my clients about, you know, it's as if you're coming into my office like when I take a dog into the vet. You know, the dog going into the vet is like this, and how can you sort of ease up a little bit and relax into this room and begin to talk about the things that are important to you that you're coming here for?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, it would be to start to learn that this is a process, and trust comes in little bits, and that not to expect of yourself when you're first coming in that you're just going to trust this person 100%. Why should you? So I'll often say to clients, particularly clients who are worried like that, well, you really don't have any good reason to trust me without knowing anything about how I am with you. And that the way trust works is you take a little step and you look and see what happens, and you take another little step and you look and see what happens. And you kind of build it that way based on what kind of response are you getting from your therapist, and is it helpful? So one thing I would do, and I know this seems kind of counterintuitive, but if you're really feeling that way, if you can let your therapist know,
I know.
that would be very helpful.
That's what we say all the time, right? If you could just tell us this, then we can talk about that.
Right.
Then we can talk about that. If you can tell me what your worst fear is just about coming into this room,
right? Yeah.
Then we can have a conversation about that. And I think sometimes clients are afraid that we're going to ask too much too quickly of them.
Yeah, and understandably, right? And then that's back to this. This is a process, and you get to trust your pace. And my job is to both encourage you to go past your comfort zone, but also to respect that you are going to go as fast as you go, and me leading you isn't going to help. You know, I kind of think of the process of me leading from behind, in a way, where I'm helping you go forward, but I'm not pulling you.
And we're not tossing you in the deep end without teaching you how to swim and tread water either.
Right.
That's the other part. You know, our job is not to let you drown.
Well, exactly. Yeah.
And that's part of it too.
Yeah.
So what we were talking about then was strategy and hope. When to me, hope is just such an important factor. But we often see people who come in feeling hopeless. They feel hopeless about their lives as a whole. They feel hopeless about their ability to affect any change in their own life. And so how do we generate that sense of hope that being here could be the start of something different and important and life-altering? Because that's how I feel when somebody comes in, is that this could be the first day of your road to transformation here.
Right. And again, that's why I said that when I think about that 15% and the strategy 15%, that it's really part of the relationship too, because I think part of where you get the hope is really in that if I feel like there's chemistry, if I feel like my therapist gets it, often it's if my therapist says something that really communicates, I can see where you are and I have a sense of where this could go. So both parts, and really being able to communicate that very quickly, I think, in the first session or two. Because I think if that hope isn't there right at the beginning, probably the client isn't going to come back.
And I think, you know, I had one of my professors in graduate school said, do something that's immediately helpful.
Yeah.
And in part, sometimes that immediately helpful is instilling a sense that I believe things can be different for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
You may not believe that right now, but I believe
Right.
that right now.
Right.
Here's a caller. I think this is important because we've been talking about trust in the relationship, and this issue is so well known to me, I sometimes forget how unknown it can be to somebody walking into my office for the first time. Julie calls in and asks, is there a therapist oath that requires the therapist to keep information confidential?
Oh, yes, absolutely. There's an oath, there's laws, there's
regulations.
codes of ethics, and there's all sorts of things. And that is an excellent question, and you're right. We sort of take that for granted that people don't, that everybody knows this, but of course everybody doesn't, like Julie and many others. And that's essential, because if you think I'm going to go tell your story to somebody who you haven't given permission, how can you possibly trust me?
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Exactly. I always say to clients that not only is there a code of ethics and are there rules and laws in place to protect you, if I break that, you will be a very rich person because you can take me to court. You know, so I have no intention of breaking that, but there is recourse for you if I do.
Yeah. Well, and I just want to say one more thing about that, or to underline it, is those laws are in place because we as a society really understand that that is so essential to this process. So it comes from a very strong value, I think.
It is, and that is, I think that if you take a look at our code of ethics, that is the basic building blocks, right?
Yep.
That is the foundation, and that we guard that with the same kind of sacredness as priests guard that in a confession, or as other religious leaders guard that.
And I think it is sacred. I think that's really a good word. And I think it's important to say that to clients, not necessarily to use the word sacred, but to get them to understand how precious and important we think this relationship is. That I'm not going to violate this, not just because there's a law out there that says I shouldn't, but because I care about you and this relationship and the sacredness of it so much that I don't want to compromise it in any way. And I think that's a really important message for clients to get.
Now, we're closing in on the end of time, but I want to get to this concept, which is, how do you plan on making me change?
Well, that's a very good question, and the answer is I don't. Because I can't. You're the one who can change. All I can do is help you. I can give you ideas. I can sometimes challenge your beliefs that you can't change, or other beliefs that you have that keep you stuck. I can provide you with a healing relationship that helps change your heart in some way, but I can't make you change. That's really, it's kind of back to the 40% that we were talking about, that the client ultimately is the one who has to make the change.
And on that note, we have to wrap up because I can't believe where the time went this evening. And so this isn't about, you know, it's the old joke of how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? One, but they really have to change. And that's a little bit what Tamara was just saying, that you really hold the power within your hands. You're not coming into an office and there's not some magical thing happening with a magic wand. The power is all within you. But you do have to give us a call to come into our door first. Thanks so much for joining the discussion this week, and don't forget to visit us on the web at speakyourmindonline.org, where you can find a schedule of our topics and resource links and read my blog, the place where I answer more of your questions. You can also email us your question about next week's show, when we'll be talking about preventing suicide in our communities. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps. Thanks for watching, and good night.